I spent 31 years in commercial real estate, but not the flashy kind you see on television. No gleaming skyscrapers, no press conferences. I hunted distressed properties in forgotten secondary markets, fixed them with my own hands, leased them out, and held them tight. It was gritty, unglamorous work. Yet those quiet years built something solid and real. By the time I turned 62, I owned 4 commercial buildings outright and had a modest residential portfolio on the side. My name was on the deeds. My calluses were on the pipes. I'd replaced myself in the early years when I couldn't afford contractors. I never drove a flashy car. I wore the same brand of boots for 15 years because they held up well, and I didn't see the point in changing what worked. My wife passed when my son was 19. Pancreatic cancer. We had 8 months between the diagnosis and the morning I held her hand for the last time. After that, it was just the two of us, me and my son, Liam. I want to be honest about what happened after she died. I overcompensated. I know that now. At the time, I told myself I was being a good father, stepping in, making sure he didn't feel the loss too sharply, cushioning every hard-edged life threw at him. If his grades slipped, I hired tutors. When he dropped out of his second year of college, I didn't push him back. I set him up with a small allowance and told him to figure himself out. When he was 25 and still figuring, I increased it. When he was 28 and moved in with a woman named Adrienne, I helped with their deposit without being asked. I want you to understand something about Adrienne before I go further. She was not a bad person in the obvious ways. She was polished. She knew the right things to say. She called me by my first name, Garrett, from the very first meeting, which I thought was forward, but chalked up to generational difference. She complimented my properties in a way that felt less like admiration and more like appraisal, but she was warm to Liam and Liam seemed happy, so I kept my mouth shut. Over the 4 years they were together before any of this happened, the monthly support I gave Liam had quietly grown from $800 to $2,200. It never happened in one jump, there was always a reason. Car trouble, a medical bill, an opportunity Liam was going to pursue that needed a little seed money. I paid for Adrienne's dental work once because they didn't have insurance and the infection was serious and I wasn't going to let someone suffer over money. Another time I wired $3,000 for what Liam described as a business consulting course. I never saw any consulting come out of it. I didn't keep a running tally. Maybe that was the problem. The February before everything changed, I noticed that the monthly transfer I'd set up, the automatic one, had been going out not to Liam's account, but to a joint account I hadn't realized they'd opened. Liam had asked me months earlier to update the routing number. I'd done it without thinking. When I mentioned this casually to Liam on the phone, he said it was just simpler that way. I let it go. That spring, I was driving back from a property inspection about 2 hours north when I called Liam to check in. We talked maybe twice a week, usually short calls. How are you? How's the knee? That kind of thing. He sounded distracted. I asked if everything was all right and he said yes. Great, actually. And then he said, Dad, there's something we've been meaning to tell you. I thought, someone's pregnant. What he said was, Adrienne and I got married 3 weeks ago. Small ceremony, just close friends. We kept it quiet because we wanted it to be private. I was on the interstate doing 70 miles an hour. I said, I'm sorry? He said it again. Married. 3 weeks ago. Close friends only. Wanted it to be intimate. I asked him how many people were at this intimate ceremony. He paused. I don't know. Maybe 150. I didn't say anything for a moment. I watched a truck merge in front of me and I let it, even though there was no reason to let it. And I just drove and breathed and tried to locate the feeling in my chest. It wasn't angry yet. It was something more like the sensation you get when you reach for something on a shelf and it isn't there. That moment of recalibration. The floor shifted half an inch. I said, why wasn't I invited? There was a pause I won't forget as long as I live. He said, it just wasn't that kind of event, Dad. We wanted it to be among our peers. Among their peers. I said, okay. I told him congratulations. I told him I'd call him later in the week. I hung up and drove in silence for 40 minutes. I didn't turn the radio on. I just drove and thought and watched the exit signs go by and tried to understand what kind of man raises a son who gets married and doesn't invite his father because his father is not among his peers. I thought about his mother. I thought about what she would have said. She would have been devastated. But she also would have known, in a way I was only beginning to understand, that we had done this. Not Adrienne. Not some outside force. We had made choices and those choices had produced a 30-year-old man who thought it was acceptable to cut his father out of his wedding because the aesthetic didn't fit. I didn't call back that week. I needed to think. 3 days after that phone call, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee when my phone rang. It was Adrienne. Not Liam. Adrienne. She said, Garrett, I wanted to reach out personally. I know Liam told you about the wedding and I hope you're not upset. We really did keep it very small, only the people who fit the vibe we were going for. I waited. She said, "Anyway, I'm actually calling because we're a little short this month. The wedding costs ran over and we've got the rent coming up. I was hoping you could transfer a little extra, maybe $4,000 on top of the usual. We'll get back on track. It's just a one-time thing." $4,000 on top of the $2,200 I was already sending, I said. "Adrienne, let me ask you something." She said, "Of course." I said, "Did you and Liam have a discussion before this call about whether it might be uncomfortable to ask me for money 3 days after telling me I wasn't invited to your wedding?" There was a pause. Then she said, "I don't think it has to be uncomfortable. It's family." I said I'd think about it. I got off the phone. I sat at that table for a long time. The coffee went cold. I looked out the window at the backyard, at the oak tree my wife had planted the year we moved in, which was now enormous and slightly in need of pruning. I thought about the word family, the way Adrian had used it, as a door that only opens one way. I called my accountant that afternoon, then I called my attorney, not to do anything yet, just to understand my options clearly. I liked having a full picture before I made any moves. It's how I operated in business and it had served me well. What I learned in those conversations sharpened things considerably. Liam's name was on 2 of the properties I owned as a secondary beneficiary, an arrangement I'd made years ago thinking it would simplify the eventual inheritance and give him some security. It was a gesture of trust, nothing more. My attorney explained that depending on how things unfolded, that arrangement was something worth reviewing. I also learned after doing some quiet math with my accountant that over the past 6 years I had transferred a total of approximately $94,000 to my son. Tuition reimbursements that never led anywhere, monthly support, one-time gifts, the dental work, the consulting course, deposits, a car repair that had been described to me as $400, but which I later learned cost $1,200. The rest had gone somewhere. $94,000. I hadn't written it all down. I hadn't tracked it. I'm not sure what I thought I was doing, honestly. I think I believed that money was a form of love, or at least a form of presence, and that if I kept sending it, I was somehow staying close to him. I did not transfer the extra $4,000. I did not transfer that month's regular amount, either. I sent Liam a short text that said I was going through some financial reorganization and that I'd be in touch when things were clearer. He didn't respond for 3 days. When he did respond, the text said, "Is everything okay? Adrian said you sounded weird on the phone." I said I was fine, just reorganizing. Another 2 days passed. Then Liam called. It was a different Liam than the one I'd spoken to in years, maybe. His voice had an edge to it that I recognized, but had never been directed at me before. He said, "Dad, what's going on? We've got bills. The rent was due yesterday." I said, "I know." He said, "Are you going to transfer it?" I said, "Liam, you're 30 years old. You've been married for a month. This feels like a conversation you and your wife should be having, not a call you make to your father." He was quiet. Then he said, "You're doing this because of the wedding." I said, "I'm doing this because of a lot of things that I should have done years ago. The wedding was just the morning I finally understood what I'd been looking at." He said, "That's not fair." I said, "What part isn't fair? The part where I paid for the last 6 years of your adult life? Or the part where you decided I wasn't the right kind of person to invite to your wedding?" He didn't have an answer for that. We stayed on the line for a moment, neither of us speaking. And then he said, quietly, "I thought you had more than enough." That sentence hit me somewhere deep, not because it was cruel, exactly, but because it was honest. He wasn't even trying to be hurtful. He genuinely believed that having more than enough meant it didn't matter where the money went or how it was taken. That the abundance made the taking invisible. I said, "I do have more than enough, that's not the point." He said, "Then what is?" I said, "That you never once asked yourself whether it was yours to take." I heard him breathing. I heard something in the background, Adrian's voice, low, asking something I couldn't make out. I said, "Liam, I love you. I want to have a real relationship with you. But I'm done funding a life you've never had to think about with a woman who called me for rent money 3 days after telling me I wasn't welcome at your wedding. That's done. If you want to talk, I'm here. If you want to build something together as adults, I'm here. But the account is closed." He said, "You can't just add, we have real expenses." I said, "I know you do. Welcome to adulthood." I hung up. I want to tell you what happened next because I think people expect one of 2 things from a story like this. Either a dramatic scene, shouting, something cinematic, or a fast reconciliation where everyone learns their lesson and hugs it out. Neither happened. What happened was quieter and harder. Liam called twice more over the next 2 weeks. Both calls were about money, not about us, not about the wedding, not about anything that mattered. Just the practical problem of the account being closed. Adrienne called once and I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that was 11 minutes long. I listened to the first 2 minutes and then I stopped. I called my attorney and we spent an afternoon going through the beneficiary arrangements. I revised them. Not to punish Liam. I want to be clear about that. I revised them because I realized I had built my estate planning around a version of my son that hadn't existed for a decade, if it had ever existed at all. I needed my arrangements to reflect reality, not hope. I also, for the first time in 6 years, sat down and made a proper accounting of what I had and what I wanted to do with it. Not because I was angry, though I was, but because I had spent years letting money flow out of my life toward people who had never been asked to value it. And I wanted to stop doing that. My wife would have wanted me to stop doing that. She was better with people than I was. She saw things clearly. She would have caught this years before I did. There was a Saturday morning in late April, about 6 weeks after the phone call on the interstate, when I drove out to look at a small warehouse property I was considering buying. It was a nothing drive. Industrial area, not scenic, but I rolled the window down anyway, and I remember the air was warm and the radio was playing something I didn't recognize. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like the inside of my chest matched the outside of the day. I thought about my wife. I thought about the oak tree. I thought about a conversation she and I had had when Liam was maybe 8 years old. One of those late-night conversations parents have when the kid is asleep and you're both tired but not sleepy. Where she said to me, "Promise me you'll let him be uncomfortable sometimes. Promise me you won't fix everything." And I had promised. And then she got sick, and he got sad, and I forgot. I broke the promise, and he grew up thinking discomfort was something fathers absorb so sons wouldn't have to feel it. That's the part that stayed with me, not the $94,000, not the wedding, not Adrian's 11-minute voicemail. Just that broken promise and what it had cost us both. Liam did eventually reach out, not about money. About 2 months after I closed the account, he sent a long text, not an apology exactly, but something adjacent to one. He said he'd been thinking. He said some things he'd done were not things he was proud of. He said Adrian and he were going through some friction, which I did not take any satisfaction in hearing, though I won't pretend I was surprised. He asked if we could have lunch. We did have lunch. It was awkward and short, and we didn't resolve anything. But he showed up without her, which felt like something. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had recently had to solve problems on his own for the first time, and the solving had been harder than he expected. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't bring up the $94,000. I ordered a sandwich, and I asked him about his week, and I listened. At the end of lunch, he said, "I'm sorry about the wedding, Dad." I said, "I know." He said, "I should have, I don't know. It was wrong." I said, "Yeah, it was." We sat with that for a moment, then I paid the check. Old habits. And we walked out into the parking lot, and I hugged him. My 30-year-old son, who had a lot of catching up to do, who I loved more than I'd ever been good at showing him in the right ways. I drove home alone. The oak tree needed pruning. I'd called someone about it the week before, and they were coming Thursday. The buildings were doing fine. The reorganization was done. I had a decent bottle of wine in the kitchen that I'd been saving for no particular occasion, and that night, for no particular occasion, I opened it. I poured a glass and stood at the window and thought about what my wife would say if she could see where we'd ended up. I think she'd say we were going to be okay. I think she'd be right. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened between me and Liam. Not to relitigate it. I'm past that. But, to understand how it got there. And the honest answer is that it got there one small decision at a time, over many years, in a direction I kept choosing because it felt like love. It wasn't love. Or it was love, but it was love with no spine in it. Love that refused to let him feel the weight of things. And weight, I've learned, is not cruelty. Weight is what builds a person. You cannot carry everything for someone and then be surprised when they don't know how to carry anything. That's the cause. The effects were what I lived through. The wedding I wasn't invited to, the phone call 3 days later asking for rent money, the casual assumption that my resources existed to absorb whatever they needed. Those things didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of a pattern I built and maintained for 30 years. Adrian didn't create my son's sense of entitlement. She just walked into a house where the lights were always on and the heat was always running and nobody had ever been handed a bill. What I had to reckon with, the part that took real honesty, was not what Liam did, it was what I had been. I was the man who confused provision with presence, who thought that as long as the transfers went through, I was doing right by him. I wasn't. I was doing right by my own need to feel useful, to feel connected to him, to feel like I hadn't failed at the one thing his mother asked me not to fail at. Intellect without honesty is just clever rationalization. I was smart enough to build 4 properties from nothing but not smart enough for a long time to look clearly at what I was doing inside my own house. That gap between what we're capable of seeing in business and what we refuse to see at home is where a lot of damage gets done quietly. The resilience part came later. Not the dramatic kind. Not some moment where I stood up straight and declared myself free. It was more like the Tuesday morning I realized I hadn't checked my phone waiting for Liam to call, or the afternoon I drove to look at that warehouse and felt, For the first time in years, like the decisions ahead of me were genuinely mine. Recovery from a pattern that long doesn't arrive in a single moment. It seeps in gradually, the way light comes through in early morning. You don't see it happen, but at some point the room is different. Liam and I are still finding our way. The lunch was a start. The apology, incomplete, uncertain, but real, was more than I expected. I don't know what we're going to be to each other yet, but I know it will have to be built on something honest or it won't hold. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this. Not that parents should be cold or the children are ungrateful. Most of them aren't, not naturally, but that the most important thing you can give someone you love is not comfort. It's the confidence that comes from knowing they can handle discomfort. That's the thing I failed to give Liam. And the thing I'm slowly, clumsily, trying to make room for now. My wife asked me to promise. I broke the promise, but I'm keeping it now, late as it is. That counts for something. I have to believe it does. Thanks for watching and remember, the craziest stories are still ahead. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.